Hello, everyone. Welcome aboard this extraordinary journey into the shadows of America's financial past. Imagine this. In the raw, unregulated dawn of our young republic, a band of greedy politicians and scheming insiders quietly sold off 35 million acres of prime American wilderness, land bigger than some entire states today, for a measly $500,000, pocketing bribes while everyday farmers and dreamers were left holding worthless paper promises that would spark lawsuits, Supreme Court battles, and reshape the very Constitution itself. That single breathtaking act of corruption in 1795 wasn't just a scam, it was the opening chapter of an era where buyer beware wasn't a warning, it was the only rule in town, and it nearly tore the nation apart before it even began. If that hook has you leaning in, stay right here, because what follows is the untold, astonishing true story of the early American buyer beware era. A wild, information-packed saga of land grabs, railroad robber barons, gold market corners, presidential family ruin, and the raw greed that built and nearly broke the United States. Picture the year 1789. The ink on the brand-new U.S. Constitution was barely dry. George Washington had just taken the oath as president, and the young nation stretched uncertainly from the Atlantic coast into vast, untamed western territories still claimed by native nations and foreign powers. Georgia, one of the original 13 states, held legal title to an enormous swath of land west of its borders, roughly 35 million acres along the Yazoo River, spanning what would become much of modern-day Alabama and Mississippi. These were fertile, river-rich lands, teeming with potential for cotton plantations, timber, and settlement. But in the chaotic post-revolutionary economy, cash was scarce, paper money was worthless, and land speculation was the hottest game in town. Ordinary citizens dreamed of cheap plots to farm and build homes, while wealthy insiders saw dollar signs in the dirt. Enter the Yazoo Land Scandal of 1895. The mother of all early American land frauds, and the perfect embodiment of the buyer beware chaos that defined the era. Georgia's legislature, meeting in the makeshift capital of Louisville, was dominated by Federalist politicians hungry for quick riches. A group of 4 shadowy land companies, the Georgia Company, Georgia-Mississippi Company, Upper Mississippi Company, and Tennessee Company, approached them with a deal that sounded too good to be true. They'd buy the entire Yazoo territory for just $500,000, about 1.5 cents per acre. In reality, the companies had no intention of developing the land themselves. Their plan was simple and ruthless. Buy low from a corrupt state government, then flip the titles at massive markups to northern investors and European speculators who had no idea what they were purchasing. What the public didn't know at the time was that the deal was greased with bribes from the very start. Historian Thomas P. Abernathy later documented how agents slipped cash, land shares, and outright promises of future profits into the pockets of nearly every legislator. Governor George Matthews, a Revolutionary War veteran himself, signed the Yazoo Act into law on January 7, 1795, transferring the massive tract without competitive bidding or public oversight. One lone holdout, a lone legislator who refused the bribes, was shouted down. The rest of the assembly voted yes in a frenzy of backroom deals conducted in smoky taverns and private parlors. News of the sale spread like wildfire, but by then the companies had already resold chunks of the land to eager buyers in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, people who believed they were investing in America's future frontier. Outrage exploded across Georgia. Petitions flooded the State House. Street demonstrations turned violent. Citizens burned effigies of the corrupt lawmakers. James Jackson, a fiery Jeffersonian Republican and U.S. Senator from Georgia, resigned his Washington seat in disgust and raced home to lead the charge. He and his allies swept into the next legislature on a wave of anti-corruption fury. In 1796, they passed the Rescinding Act, nullifying the entire Yazoo sale and ordering the public burning of all records of the original act right there on the Capitol grounds at high noon, flames licking the sky as a symbolic purge of the fraud. The state even tried to return the $500,000 purchase price, but the damage was done. Innocent third-party buyers who had purchased the land in good faith from the original companies now held titles that Georgia suddenly declared worthless. The scandal didn't stay local. It spiraled into a national crisis that tested the fragile new federal government. Lawsuits piled up for years. Speculators sued the state, arguing that a sovereign government couldn't simply rip up contracts after the fact. The case dragged all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1810 as Fletcher versus Peck. Chief Justice John Marshall, in a landmark ruling, sided with the buyers. He declared that the original Yazoo Act was a binding contract, and Georgia's rescinding law violated the Constitution's contract clause. It was the first time the Supreme Court struck down a state law as unconstitutional, a precedent that protected property rights but also shielded fraudsters from immediate justice. The decision fueled years of litigation and political bitterness. To finally settle the mess, Georgia ceded all its Western claims to the federal government in the Compact of 1802, receiving $1.25 million in compensation, while the U.S. assumed the legal headaches and extinguished remaining Native American titles. The Yazoo fraud didn't just enrich a few insiders. It helped carve out the Mississippi Territory, accelerated Western expansion, and planted the seeds of states' rights arguments that would echo into the Civil War. But the Yazoo affair was no isolated blip. It was the opening salvo of an entire era where buyer beware was the iron law of American finance. With no federal securities regulator, no SEC, no meaningful disclosure rules, and courts that often favored the powerful, fraud flourished like weeds in fertile soil. Land speculation became a national obsession. In the early 1800s, waves of land jobbers, speculators armed with military warrants, fraudulent surveys, and forged deeds, flooded the market. Venus military land warrants, issued to revolutionary soldiers, were bought and sold multiple times, sometimes layered on the same plot of ground. Buyers arriving to claim their property often discovered it already occupied or non-existent. Timothy Dwight, president of Yale, observed in his travels that several patents were often placed successively on the same tracts, leaving honest settlers ruined. The pattern repeated across the young republic. In Ohio and the Old Northwest, companies like the Ohio Company of Associates and Sims Purchase snapped up millions of acres from the federal government at rock-bottom prices, then resold them to immigrants at huge profits, often without clear titles or surveys. Washington, D.C. itself became a boomtown of speculation when lots in the new federal city were hawked to investors like Englishman Thomas Law, who poured money into undeveloped swampland only to watch values crash. Even founding fathers weren't immune. Some, like James Wilson, a Supreme Court justice, dabbled in Western land deals that went sour. The lack of regulation meant buyers had no reliable way to verify claims. Deeds were handwritten on fragile paper, surveys were crude, and courts were slow and biased toward insiders. As the 19th century marched forward, the scams evolved from raw land grabs to more sophisticated financial manipulations, but the buyer beware ethos remained unchanged. Railroads became the new frontier of fraud, promising to knit the nation together while lining pockets. The Crédit Mobilier scandal of the 1960s and 70s stands as one of the most brazen examples. Union Pacific Railroad executives, building the eastern half of the first transcontinental railroad, created a sham construction company called Crédit Mobilier of America. They awarded themselves inflated contracts. The actual cost to lay track was about $50 million, but Crédit Mobilier billed Union Pacific $94 million, pocketing the difference. To protect their scheme from congressional scrutiny, they bribed lawmakers with discounted stock and cash. Vice President Schuyler Colfax, Speaker James G. Blaine, and even future President James Garfield were among those who received shares at bargain prices. When the New York Sun broke the story in 1872, it rocked the Grant administration and exposed how railroad barons had turned public infrastructure into a private piggy bank. Ordinary investors who bought Union Pacific stock based on glowing reports lost fortunes when the truth emerged. Congress held hearings, but punishments were light, further proof that in the buyer beware world, the powerful rarely paid the full price. The Gilded Age cranked the greed to 11. Wall Street, still a chaotic outdoor market in the 1860s, became a playground for manipulators like Jay Gould and Jim Fisk. In 1869, these two robber barons, already notorious for their Erie Railroad stock watering and bribery schemes, hatched the audacious plan to corner the entire U.S. gold market. Gould, a quiet, calculating financier, often called the Mephistopheles of Wall Street, enlisted Fisk, the flamboyant showman, and Abel Rathbone, President Ulysses S. Grant's brother-in-law. Their strategy was devilishly simple: convince Grant not to sell government gold from the Treasury, creating artificial scarcity. As gold prices skyrocketed from $130 to $162 per ounce in days, speculators who had sold short were crushed. On September 24, 1869, forever known as Black Friday, panic selling triggered a market collapse. Fortunes evaporated overnight. Gould quietly sold his holdings at the peak, walking away richer, while Fisk and others took the public blame. The scandal implicated the president's family and exposed how a tiny cabal could manipulate the nation's currency for personal gain. Thousands of farmers, merchants, and small investors who relied on stable gold prices for trade were devastated. Yet no one went to prison. The era's weak laws offered little recourse. The buyer beware spirit reached its most heartbreaking peak in the 1880s with the Grant and Ward affair, the Ponzi scheme that ruined a Civil War hero and former president. Ferdinand Ward, a slick young operator dubbed the Young Napoleon of Finance, partnered with Ulysses S. Grant, Jr., or Buck, in 1880 to form the brokerage firm Grant and Ward on Wall Street. They promised investors sky-high returns, 2 to 3% per month, by claiming insider access to lucrative government contracts. The firm's name, backed by the legendary general Ulysses S. Grant himself, who invested $100,000 of his own money and later joined as a partner, drew in widows, veterans, and working-class savers. Ward was secretly running a classic Ponzi, paying early investors with new money while using the same collateral for multiple loans and siphoning funds for his lavish lifestyle. By early 1884, the house of cards crumbled. On May 6th, the firm collapsed, wiping out the Grants' entire fortune. The former president, already battling cancer and poverty, was left with just $80 in his pocket. Julia Grant had another 130. Ward was convicted of grand larceny and sent to Sing Sing, but the damage was irreversible. The scandal triggered the Panic of 1884, a broader Wall Street crash that ruined countless families. Thomas Nast, the famous political cartoonist, lost everything too.
These weren't isolated incidents, they were symptoms of a systemic disease. From the 1790s through the early 1900s, America operated under pure caveat emptor. There were no mandatory disclosures, no independent audits, no federal oversight of stock exchanges or land sales. Banks loaned on inflated collateral, promoters issued watered stock, and newspapers were sometimes bought off to hype bogus ventures. The savings and loan precursors and early insurance scams preyed on the trusting. Even P.T. Barnum, the great showman, openly admitted that in financial deals, everyone expected to be cheated. Courts rarely intervened unless fraud was egregious and provable, and victims often had no resources to sue powerful insiders. The result? Booms followed by devastating busts, wealth concentrated in robber baron hands, and ordinary Americans, immigrants, farmers, veterans, bearing the losses. Yet this wild era also fueled explosive growth. Railroads connected coasts, cities rose from prairie, and capital flowed into industry. The very scandals exposed the need for change, planting seeds for later reforms like the Blue Sky Laws of the 1910s, and ultimately the SEC in 1934. Think about the human cost woven through it all. In Yazoo country, native tribes like the Choctaw and Chickasaw lost ancestral lands as titles were extinguished. In the railroad scandals, Chinese and Irish immigrant laborers built tracks under brutal conditions while executives dined on profits. During the gold corner, Midwestern farmers couldn't sell crops profitably as currency gyrated. And in Grant and Ward, Civil War widows who trusted the president's name saw their life savings vanish. These stories weren't abstract, they were lived by real people whose letters, diaries, and court testimonies paint a picture of betrayal on a national scale. Greed wasn't new, but the lack of rules made it lethal. Charismatic con men like Ward and Gould thrived because information was scarce, verification impossible, and accountability rare. As the 20th century dawned, the buyer beware era began to crack under its own weight. The Panic of 1907 and earlier crashes showed that unchecked speculation endangered the entire economy. Progressive reformers and muckraking journalists demanded transparency. But the lessons from Yazoo to Grant and Ward echo even today. When rules are weak, the powerful exploit the trusting. The Supreme Court's Fletcher versus Peck decision protected contracts but also highlighted the tension between property rights and public integrity. Crédit Mobilier forced Congress to confront its own corruption. Black Friday revealed the dangers of market manipulation, and the Grant scandal humanized the devastating personal toll. This is the astonishing true history of America's financial Wild West, a time when a handful of bribes could redraw maps, a whispered word from the White House could spike gold prices, and even a president's family could be left penniless by a smiling swindler. It built the nation we know, but at a staggering human price. The buyer beware era wasn't just about scams, it was about the raw, unregulated ambition that forged modern America. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What kind of story would you like next? A deep dive into a specific scandal like the Gilded Age robber barons, modern crypto parallels, or perhaps the birth of investor protections? Be sure to comment below and let us know your thoughts. We read every single one. Wishing you all the very best. May the hard-won lessons of history guard your dreams and your dollars. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and until next time, take care.